The subject of slavery will inevitably come up whenever a Christian begins quoting passages from the Bible that forbid homosexuality. Their claim is that the Bible both upholds and supports the evil institution of slavery. Therefore, why should we listen to it whenever it speaks about the subject of homosexuality? To many of them, they believe that the Bible is inherently a slave-supporting book and therefore not worthy of our respect and obedience. So, ultimately, the question is, what does the Bible actually say, both the Old and the New Testaments, about slavery? Does the God of the Bible sanction or endorse the evil practice of slavery? Well, I don't believe he does, and that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to consider both Old and New Testament passages on this subject. And what I see in the Bible is a type of incremental revelation on God's part, where God is patient and he's working with his people to move us towards the ideal in the right direction. So he works with individuals and nations. So in the Bible we're talking about the nation of Israel, and then later we're talking about individual Christians in the New Testament. So God takes people right where they are. He takes us where we are spiritually, personally, emotionally, financially, whatever the case may be, and moves us towards the ideal, moves us towards the perfect goal that he has intended or he has in mind. To give you an example, imagine a person who just became a brand new Christian. Nobody expects them to be as knowledgeable about the Bible, to be as mature or as spiritually established as somebody who's been a Christian for a very long time. No, we know that there's a process of growth. And so we see that even in the Bible, that God is working with people to move us in the right direction. In fact, as we look at the Old Testament times prior to the giving of the law, slavery was a very common practice. And then we have God moving them towards humanitarian reforms or limitations on slavery in the Old Testament law. And then ultimately in the New Testament we see that God is revealing his ideal, which is ultimately the elimination of slavery. And that's what we will see in this process that God is taking us through. So as we travel back in time to when Israel was established as a nation following their nearly 430-year exile in the nation of Egypt, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, we find that slavery was a brutal, rampant, and unregulated institution. And so God begins the process of moving his people away from slavery altogether. And it makes perfect sense. The book of Exodus is a book in the Bible that reveals that God is the ultimate slave rescuer. He is, after all, rescuing his people from their bondage in the nation of Egypt. Now, you might ask, why didn't God just eliminate or terminate the whole entire practice of slavery all of a sudden, all at once? Well, you have to understand that when Moses becomes the leader of the nation of Israel, he inherits a situation that is tenuous at best. 2 million, around 2 million people that one man is supposed to basically corral and guide and be in control of. So, a very difficult situation there, and it takes time to transform a nation or a culture, especially when you're talking about something that is as deeply entrenched as slavery. So the speed of the process is dictated by the people that God is working with, because as I've said over and over, our God is a very patient God. And the nation of Israel was no different than a lot of people, challenging authority and literally constantly threatening rebellion against Moses. In fact, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 19, this is where the people are receiving the law, the 10 Commandments, more particularly, from Mount Sinai. God is speaking to them. They see smoke. They see fire on the top of the mountain, and the earth is trembling, and the people are afraid, and they tell Moses, please tell God to stop talking with us, because we are afraid that we will die if he continues. So could you speak to us on his behalf? In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 through 20, it also tells us, though, that not only did the people say that they wanted him to stop speaking, God to stop speaking, because of their fear, it also tells us that the reason why they didn't is because they could not bear to hear any more rules. Does that sound familiar? Well, God knows, basically, how much we can and can't handle. He understands that change doesn't happen overnight. You can only push people so far, so fast, before you begin to undermine the entire process altogether. That's true when you raise children, for example. In the Bible it says, Paul tells us not to exasperate our children. Don't expect too much too fast. And it's a similar situation with adults. I would say it's an even more delicate or difficult situation. So let's now begin to take a look at what the Bible in the Old Testament actually has to say about the subject of slavery. As we begin to take a look at what the Old Testament has to say about the subject of slavery, I want to begin by looking at Hebrew slaves, or the taking of slaves from amongst their own people. According to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39, we're told two things. One, they're not allowed to take slaves from amongst their own people. And secondly, we're told that they can become an indentured servant, which is a voluntary type of servitude in which a person willingly, contractually agrees to give up certain freedoms to become a servant for a specified limited period of time in exchange for the provision of certain necessities like food, clothing, and shelter. But the Bible also provides limits even on the practice of indentured servitude. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12, we are told that you are only allowed to have an indentured servant for 7 years, and then you must set them free. Also in that same chapter, verses 13 through 15, it tells us that when you do set them free, you're not allowed to just say, you're free, now get out of here, but rather you are to provide for them. You are to give them provisions from the grain, from the flocks, or from the wine. So in other words, you are to send them off amply supplied for their many years of hard and faithful service. Then if you look at the Old Testament and what it says about foreign slaves, we begin with Exodus chapter 21, verse 20, which basically says that if you have a slave and that you beat them with the rod and they die, you are to be punished. Now some people will look at that verse and see the glass half empty, as if it were a license to abuse your slaves, that you can beat them within an inch of their life, and if they don't die, you get away with it. But actually, that's not the case at all. If you look a few verses ahead of this, you will see in verse 12 that we're being told that if you take the life of someone, that your life will be demanded. So you also, the murderer, will experience capital punishment. Now, then you see this verse saying that the slave receives the same rights. It's equal protection under the law. We're being told that if you take not only the life of a Hebrew, but also the life of a slave, you do not get away with it. Now, for further proof that the Bible does not provide a license to abuse your slaves, you just have to look at Exodus chapter 21, verses 26 through 27, which says that if you permanently harm your slave, if you seriously hurt them, that they have to be immediately set free. You might then say, well, what about those that aren't permanently harmed or seriously hurt? Will they get away with abusing their slaves to a lesser extent? Not at all, because Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15 through 16 very clearly states that if a slave is abused and then they escape, try to get away from this cruel master, that they are to be granted asylum, granted a refuge. You're not allowed to send them back, and that they then are free completely to do whatever they want to do and to live wherever they want to live. So this was what you might call for the slaves an escape clause. In addition to that, the slaves were also allowed to participate in the spiritual benefits and blessings of the nation, as a regular Hebrew would get to do. For example, we have the fourth commandment that gives the people the right to a day of rest. And the slaves are included in this privilege. You can't make them work, according to Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 14, and also Exodus chapter 23, verse 12. Furthermore, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 9 through 12, we are told that they, the slaves that is, get to participate in the national, religious, holidays, and festivals. They get to participate in the fun, the food, and the fellowship as well, just like an official citizen of the nation of Israel. Also, the slaves and those who are in poverty, they have a sort of ancient version of social welfare. Obviously, it's not as sophisticated as ours, but you got to give them a break. We find that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, and also in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10, that if someone is harvesting their fields and they overlook something or drop something, that they are not to go back and pick it up, but that they are to leave that for the poor. And they are also not to harvest to the very edges of their field. Those areas are also left for the poor. And all throughout these guidelines that God is giving, we see him dropping hints as to the ideal that he has in mind. We see this same phrase repeated over and over again in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, also chapter 15, verse 15, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 12, 24, verse 18, and 24, verse 22. And here's what he says: remember that you were slaves. In other words, it's like the early version of the Golden Rule. Remember what it was like. Put yourself in their shoes. Do unto them as you would have them do unto you. So the Old Testament focus here is very clearly on instituting some limitations on the brutal practice of slavery. So instituting some humanitarian reforms, all with the purpose and the ideal of moving the nation, the people of Israel, in the right direction. And now we're going to look at what the New Testament has to say about the subject of slavery as well.